first time I'm presenting on this. I've been doing some research and some work on this for a while, but I'm very excited to bring the information that I have. My position for the last almost 10 years has been as the EMS Education Coordinator in our state government office. Prior to that, I've been a longtime paramedic and EMS educator, over 30 years for both. And I look forward to this. So thank you. So this presentation on bias in education, it will not just be about race and culture and how we as educators can help improve in these areas, but it will also be about areas of our own implicit biases that may be affecting our students. It's an opportunity for all of us to learn a little bit more about how we can recognize and change our own personal biases, some that we may not even recognize today as we walked into this classroom. So our objectives, we want to understand bias, recognize bias in our daily discussions, find resources on implicit bias, and I have a lot of great ones for you, prevent bias in the clinical environment, assist others to overcome bias in their daily lives, and improve the educational experience for our students. Those are the objectives for this next hour. So bias by definition is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or a group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. You've undoubtedly heard the term bias over the past couple of years. Bias training has taken a front seat in many corporations, healthcare entities, educational institutions, governmental entities. While the discussions have been louder in our country since the killing of George Floyd, the truth is that bias has been mentioned in our publishers' materials in the years prior to that day. So we're going to put up our first poll question. And if you could answer this honestly, I would appreciate it. Our first poll question is, have you attended any sessions on bias, racism, etc. in the past 2 years? Excellent. So about 70-30 that they have attended sessions on bias, and that's great. I appreciate that. So our next slide, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get to the next slide. There we go. Here's our results, about 70-30, like I said. So our next slide is going to talk about the EMS Agenda 2050, the vision for the Agenda 2050. If none of you were able to participate in any work groups during that Agenda 2050 coming up, or that was published, I'm sorry, in 2019, it's unfortunate. It really was a very interesting work group. How do you predict what is going to happen in 30 years from now? What our vision is in a socially equitable system, access to care, quality of care, and outcomes are not determined by age, socioeconomic status, gender, ethnicity, geography, or other social determinants. In every single community in our nation, EMS systems will provide any resident or visitor the best possible care and services in order to maintain the health of individuals and populations. Caregivers feel confident and prepared when caring for children, people who speak different languages, persons with disabilities, or other populations that they may not interact with frequently. There is a lot of research that goes into finding out the disparities that we have in healthcare. It shows that in EMS, just like the rest of healthcare, what a person looks like, or where you can see that this quote is regarding a she. It's because it is regarding a specific scenario in this document. But where this person lives or looks like can impact the level of care they receive at the system level and at the individual level. So there are many research and resource documents within the EMS Agenda 2050. If you have not read through it, I highly recommend you do so. References to the research, like I said, are listed, but these disparities are not solely the result of explicit bias against people in rural communities or endemic racism. They also stem from systemic and complex issues such as inadequate funding, a lack of cultural competencies. Sometimes you hear cultural humility, which I like a little bit better than competencies, and then implicit bias. So when you're talking about bias, there's generally two that we're going to talk about: implicit versus explicit. Implicit or unconscious bias would be the people can act on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without intending to do so. Explicit or conscious bias would be the person is very clear about their feelings and attitudes, and related behaviors are conducted with intent. So do you know today, walking into this, what implicit biases you may be bringing into the classroom? I have learned a few about myself during this project. What attitude do you send to your students when talking about that area of town, or that nursing home, or the homeless shelter, prostitution, young people, old people, people of various cultures, people of a different race than what you are, people who tax the system with frequent calls, maybe those ETOHers? What kind of a bias are you projecting onto the student? Maybe you don't see the bias in yourself, but others do. And many of them will take your word for it. They'll end up with the same biases going forward. And really, when you're talking about explicit biases, there's no room in our society for those, none at all. As an educator, we have a responsibility to learn about our own biases and then put a big stop sign on any biases that you may see in your program. And we'll talk about that more throughout today as we move along. I have a short video for you. It's just over 3 minutes. It's a pretty good video that just explains this a little more in detail.
New research from the fields of neuroscience and social psychology has shed light onto the concept of unconscious bias. But what exactly is unconscious bias, and how does it affect our behaviors and decisions? Unconscious biases are simply our unintended people preferences. They are formed by our socialization, our personal experiences, and the representations of different groups in the media. These experiences act as social filters in which we make assessments and judgments of people around us. Research tells us that human beings have a natural tendency to place individuals into social categories. These categories are often based on visual cues such as gender, cultural background, age, height, or body size. We also categorize based on social background, job roles, religious identity, or political affiliation. The unconscious brain uses associations based on social categories to develop biases. For example, if we are constantly exposed to women as primary school teachers or receptionists, or men as plumbers and organizational leaders, these associations become wired within the human brain. The unconscious brain uses social categories to make unconscious judgments about people who are similar to us and people who are different from us. A common form of unconscious bias is affinity bias. This type of bias impacts talent processes in organizational decision-making, including how we recruit. Managers are more likely to hire people who look similar or with sounding names to them. Work allocation. Managers are more likely to assign key client projects to individuals within their teams who they have an unconscious affinity with. Performance. Where there is some kind of affinity, managers are more likely to spend time informally discussing positive contributions to the team and will focus on development and future work plans. For those where there is little affinity, managers are more likely to question past performance. The conversation will be less friendly and even hostile at times. Unconscious bias often results in a set of microbehaviors. Examples of positive microbehaviors include supporting the ideas of someone with who you have an unconscious affinity whilst in a team meeting, or simply wanting to have coffee with someone like you. Examples of negative microbehaviors include checking emails on your phone whilst talking to a colleague or cutting someone off in a meeting. Often our intention is not to make biased decisions, and through a focus on conscious thinking and by creating inclusive work cultures, we can learn to control our unconscious judgments and mitigate the impact of bias on our talent programs. For more information on the nature of unconscious bias and how to mitigate its effects, contact ENEI.
So I like that video. Like I said, it's pretty short and sweet, but it explains a little bit more. When we talk about affinity, the sameness, lack of diversity, groupthink. When we think of peanut butter, most of us think of jelly. Peanut butter and jelly go together. And some people put bananas on their peanut butter sandwich or some other crazy thing. But generally, the affinity with peanut butter would be jelly. And many people cannot associate it without that being there. The same with salt and pepper. If you're talking about seasoning food, you would think salt and pepper go together, their affinity. And now we're going to get into a little uncomfortable situation. This person with blonde hair and blonde jokes go together, right? This affinity. As an educator, we have to recognize that this is offensive to many. The affinity here is that blondes are dumb or that blondes are unable to think clearly. Have you ever had an instructor tell you a blonde joke? I have blonde hair, and I have had an educator, my instructor, tell me a blonde joke. It was really pretty offensive. And I told him that it was offensive and they really should not do that in the classroom. This brings us to our next poll question. And in this poll question, what I want to know is, have you, as an educator, completed an objective bias survey? So I'm watching the poll numbers go. Thank you all for participating. About 72% have participated, and we have a little more than half who participated that have not done an objective bias survey. And maybe you don't know that there are those resources out there for you. So that's why I'm here today, is to show you that. So about 75% of you who are attending today have taken this objective bias survey and poll question. About 52% of you have not taken one, 48% have. So that is great. Thank you for that. And I will show you a resource that's available for you. and it's through Harvard. It's called implicit association test. Now, I have to tell you, you have to have some time, if you have about a half an hour, to take this test. It's available for anyone to take. And of course, the research is being done based on those. It really is a pretty neat. It's very objective, and they have some disclaimers on it. But if you go to that website, you'll be able to find it. Even if you do a quick Google search, on the Google search, you can find this Harvard implicit association test. So let's take a look at this picture. This picture maybe is a stereotype or a bias. What do we teach in our EMS classes about homeless? We respond to homeless citizens often in our line of work. Do we stereotype them when we talk about them? Do we leave our students to believe that alcoholism or drug abuse or addiction created the homeless population? Why would that matter? It doesn't matter. These people do not have a home to live in. What if our students had an assignment to spend a few hours at the local homeless shelter and then share their experience with the rest of the class? What if they were given a grade for it or an extra credit for it? Maybe it would be a clinical assignment in an alternate location. What would be the difference in their care as they move forward as a licensed EMS professional if they had that experience prior to getting their license? I'm very fortunate that a high school EMT class that I taught was able to help out in a homeless shelter. And it was an amazing experience for each person that was able to do it, which was the majority of the class, because the knowledge they gained from that day will stay with them forever. Again, is it a bias that maybe we are showing to our students, or as they go on their clinical assignments that they're seeing from their clinical preceptors? This photo may be a preconceived notion about low-income housing. How can we as educators prevent these biases or stereotypes when we respond to those calls? And I'll talk a little bit more about this one here in a short time. This is one of my favorite stereotypes, and I know that sounds odd as I'm speaking, but let me tell you about some of the most amazing friends that I have. Jessa, I'll show you Jessa, is a great friend of mine, someone that I could not have any more admiration for. Jessa was born into a family of abusers. Physical and sexual abuse are her first memories of life. She was in several child porn videos created at her home by her family. At the young age of preteen, she was sold by her parents to a pimp and was trafficked from Canada to the United States, where she was sold for sex in several states in the United States. In her 20s, she was able to escape, get into a safe house. Now, within the last 10 to 12 years, she has a master's degree in Christian counseling and is now working on her PhD. She was featured last week in People magazine in February of 2022. But this is what happens when you stereotype or show your bias. Who would have ever thought to have asked her if she needed help, if she called 911 during this time, or if they saw her on the streets? I'm very happy that human trafficking is now in the education standards because we could all learn a little bit more about what we don't know because we've never been exposed to it before. We've had a stereotype or a bias in our minds possibly in the past about this. I've learned so much about human trafficking over the last few years, and I love to spread that word. So I will stop talking about human trafficking now and continue on with bias in education. Did a quick Google search. I just wanted to see, and I typed in ad for business attire. And this was the first photo that popped up. So what does this tell us? If we're looking for business attire, we are going to see male clothing and all white. So white male clothing is what we see when we just do a Google search on business attire. This is an EMS leadership conference photo. If you were to look around this room in this photo, what do you see? You see a lot of what we saw in the last picture, the previous picture. But you know, studies have actually shown that females and minority racial and ethnic groups remain underrepresented in EMS. They did a 10-year assessment from 2008 to 2017. I'll have all of my resources listed here at the end as well. But this is a fantastic research article on this. I can tell you that anytime I speak at a state or a national conference, when I look out at the crowd, I see white males. And we are in a situation where we are severely understaffed in EMS. And maybe we can start thinking outside of the box, reach out to some demographics that aren't white male, and try to get a more diverse population into EMS. And I'll talk more about that shortly. So let's talk about culture, the attitude, values, and behaviors of a particular group of individuals, or a group of people who share experiences, language, and values that permit them to communicate knowledge not shared by those outside their culture. So whether you're white, Black, Christian, atheist, Arab, Jewish, straight, gay, transgender, blonde, brunette, redhead, female, male, Hispanic, we are all very different. And we only know our own culture. If you look around your current classroom, what culture is your current class? Why not shake it up a little bit and talk about it in the classroom? Have those uncomfortable conversations. It takes all of us to learn about other cultures, to grow and recognize that together we can better make the world go round. Another thing to look at is that we don't all learn the same. Some of your students have full-time jobs, some are single parents, some are taking the class just to gain information, maybe for another healthcare profession. Some are in this class to further their career. Some students are very good in math, while some prefer science. You have to alter your classroom environment to be inclusive for all. If you don't recognize it and talk about it and make adjustments, then some of your students are not going to be successful. A perfect classroom is no longer the instructor standing at the front of the class and using a PowerPoint like I'm doing now, and just reading off of a PowerPoint. We have learned over the years that you have to shake it up a little bit to better the education and learning environment for everyone. So I promised you a story earlier about clinical conflicts. Let's talk about a specific call, and this did happen to one of my students more than 10 years ago. They were doing a third ride or a clinical assignment, and they were dispatched to the projects for an assault. En route, the medic driving told this student that the student had to stay in the truck, keep the doors locked during the call, and only open the doors for us when we arrive back at the patient. So this is an unknown call for an assault, and this student really had no idea what was going on, but was a little scared. So when they got back to the ambulance, the patient was awake, alert, had some pain in their arm, leg, and back, described it as 8 out of 10 in the pain scale. The student noted that the medic seemed short with the patient, did not offer or administer any pain medications. And when asked later, the medic told the student that the patient, they knew who the patient was. It was a frequent flyer and is addicted to narcotics. So how do you as the educator handle this discussion? I was pretty upset with the clinical preceptor, of course, because it showed their biases pretty clearly to the student. The student did not want me to approach the clinical agency because they were afraid of going back there for another clinical. Maybe they wanted to work for that agency once they were licensed and did not want to have to consider being bullied because they told on them. So how do you approach this with the clinical source? It's important as an educator to have these discussions with your clinical sites prior to the class beginning their rotations. We have to ensure that our students are not subject to these biases. The student will likely be afraid, like I said, to discuss because they're unsure what's going to happen to them for discussing it. So be proactive in those discussions with your clinical sites. Maybe these clinical sites should be on your advisory committee. And those discussions can happen during your annual or biannual advisory committee meetings. The last thing we want is for our students to walk into a clinical site and recognize a very explicit bias. And so again, look for those answers before there are questions. There are many research articles out there that discuss healthcare disparities in pain management based on race. This is one example for you. I'll show you a fantastic website at the end of this session that will has many resources for you. But if you read through some of these, you really understand that there is an influence of patient race on administration of analgesia by paramedic students, and in healthcare in general. So once we recognize that, we learn from it and we do better. And that's the important message to get across today. Here is a photo of a diverse classroom. Is this what your classroom looks like? If it isn't, how can we change that? Let's work on diversifying our field. How do you recruit for your program? Are there opportunities to widen your horizon? Start to think about ways that we can recruit in areas that you may not have thought of before. EMS is obviously, again, going through a staffing crisis. Have you discussed options in altering your class schedules to accommodate maybe some demographics that just cannot attend a class during the week? Maybe there's a weekend option, maybe less evening hours. If you have a hybrid course, realize ahead of time that not everyone has internet access and it's not good with computers. And I think that's a lesson we've all learned over the last 2 years since COVID hit. But what can we do better? Where can we promote our education programs? Where can we make EMS a real life opportunity for demographics that may not have known that was an opportunity that they could get into? These are areas that we can start being preemptive on to get a more diverse classroom. And what's exciting is we'll have a more diverse group of professionals out there. I know many of you have read it and utilized this book, The Foundation of Education. The third edition, chapter 6, is on the culture in the EMS classroom. So if we teach with a one-size-fits-all attitude, we're failing our students and ourselves. There was a time when I had to tell my students that if they had a tattoo that could be seen, it would have to be covered up during clinical assignments, because those were policies at the clinical sites. times have changed and they're still changing. Maybe you still have that requirement. Maybe we can work with our clinical sites to change that narrative. Our classrooms are filled with young people, middle-aged people, sometimes older adults, people with purple hair, blue hair, piercings everywhere, gender changes, differing learning abilities, language variances, marital status, political views, religions, socioeconomic status, and so on. To make a more inclusive environment, we as educators have to be flexible and start thinking outside of that box and really work on creating a better learning environment for all of us. In this book, I thought this was a very good quote out of the book. Each student is an individual and does not deserve to be limited to being viewed as a representative of any one group. And that's important for us as educators to remember when we're having discussions in our classroom. So moving on, I'm going to talk about some of my favorite subjects to teach. I love to teach about the airway. I love cardiac emergencies, pediatric assessments, strokes, human trafficking. Obviously, you heard that. I could talk for days about that. Pathophys. I know you're thinking I'm crazy for liking to teach pathophys, but I do. 12-lead EKG interpretation, infant safe sleep, advanced airway, interpersonal communications. I love all those subjects. I love teaching those. And then some of my not so favorite topics: CBIRD, hazmat, suctioning, seizures, anatomy. Why do I like pathophys, but I don't like teaching anatomy? I don't know. GI issues, radio communications, documentation. So what is my point here? You could probably tell in my voice the difference between my favorites and my not so favorites. Will my favorite topics become the students' favorites, and will my not so favorite topics become my students' not so favorite topics? Just it all depends on how I present my materials. I know that there's a bias there in my teaching, so how can I change my attitude about those topics? So this brings us to our third poll question. And I want to know, are there areas that you have discovered today that you may have been applying a bias in your classroom? And you can put comments in the Q&A or the chat as well, and we'll talk about this here at the end. But this is what I want to know is, are there areas that you have discovered today that you may have been applying a bias in your classroom? About 45% of you have answered so far. 51, that's good. Still going, we're about 72% that have answered so far. %, sorry. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. So about 54% of you have answered yes, that you have discovered today that you may have been applying a bias in your classroom. And that makes me happy, because that means that us talking about this today is helping you to realize some of your own biases. Like I said, I have been working on this presentation for months, and I have a little different one for in-person where I have a couple more videos, and it's generally going to be a 2-hour session because I don't like videos to teach for me, but there are a lot of good videos out there on bias and overcoming bias. But I'm glad that many of you have discovered today that you've recognized some of those biases. I said earlier in the session, it isn't just about racial or gender or cultural biases, but it can be about things too. So even the subjects that you teach, it really depends on the attitudes that you're bringing into the classroom. So thank you for answering that and being honest in these poll questions. That is the last poll question. So our next slide, sorry, I'm trying to get it to move. There we go. What about those favorite students? The favorites. The ones that make you go, they're always on time. They help set up the classroom, stays after class to talk, requests extra clinical hours, requests to be a patient in your other classes or labs. They're the ones who always turn the assignments in early. They get good grades. They're the favorites. It's a perfect student, right? What message are you sending to other students in the class when you have that favorite student? Again, maybe when you call on this person when they raise their hand, because that person's always going to raise their hand. And you have a big old smile on your face when you're talking to them or answer them. And you don't when others do. Just something simple like that can really set a bias. But what is the message that's sent to the other students? They know that that student can do anything they want in the class because they're never going to get in trouble because they're your favorite. What if a different student is late 3 out of the last 4 days? Are you annoyed with them? Do you place them on academic probation because you've got your rules set up in your syllabus for tardiness? Or instead, do you try to find the root cause and get them some help? Maybe they don't have reliable transportation. Maybe their babysitter isn't a reliable person. Maybe their job holds them over. We know in EMS, you get held over all the time. So can we cut them some slack, find that root cause, and maybe find them a resource to help them get to class on time? As a professional, we have to treat all of our students equally. With experience, we learn that a significant amount of time is taken by a small number of people, right? And we've often heard that 90% of my time is occupied by 10% of the people. But no one should feel or should leave the class feeling like you're treating one person differently than the other. So it's another bias that we have to recognize and eliminate. Perception is reality for many people. So if they perceive that you have that favorite student and they recognize that you really were annoyed with that person for being late on the 3rd day, that is a perception that's going to keep in all of your students' minds forever. So it's something we can work on, which brings us to equity versus equality. There is a difference. Equality would be every student receives the same level of attention and support. We know with our experience, it's hard to do that because of that 90-10 that we've discussed. Equity requires a conscious effort. Those are key words, conscious effort, to implement various approaches to foster an excellent learning environment. We have to recognize that EMS is a dominant white male profession. So if you're using textbooks, have you looked through your textbooks to see if you have diverse photos in that book? If you were someone of a different race or gender than what the majority of your photos are in the book, do you feel like you are welcome into this path? So we do have room to grow in our workforce, and it begins in the classroom. Do you have mentors available for your students? It's pretty easy to find reliable mentors in the field, so utilize them. You want those with positive attitudes, with minimal biases, with the recognition that there's room to grow and expand on their knowledge. Utilize them. Get them involved with your students. Get your students involved with those mentors. And together, we can create a better field out there. I know this is going to sound crazy, but when I was working on my master's in education, one of my classes, it was an entire semester on classroom management. And when I had taken that class, it was a requirement. I thought this is going to be an easy class, and I don't think I'm going to get much out of this class. The truth is that was one of my favorite classes because I learned a lot about managing the classroom. And really, other than your standard policies that you have in your syllabus already typed out for them, what if you spent that first day having them get involved in recognizing what the requirements are? Maybe start out with a diversity statement and have your students help you write a diversity statement and have that posted in your classroom. It can be a paragraph or a section that's institutional, department, or course language that welcomes the range of student identities, experiences, perspectives, particularly those that have been traditionally marginalized. Structure conversations to encourage respectful and equitable participation. So instructors or educators can establish ground rules for specific guidelines for appropriate behavior early in the semester. Again, I would start it on day one. Make sure everybody understands all the rules, recognizes, reads, and understands the diversity statement, and factors that into their everyday classroom environment. Include a confidentiality, respectful disagreement, and civil debate. Use small groups to encourage non-competitive ways of learning and encourage cross-cultural communication. So instructors, sorry about that, if some students are hesitant to speak up in class, they might contribute in small groups first. So instructors or educators should pay careful attention to the group dynamics. Intervene if some students become excluded from full participation and be more assertive, those more assertive students that begin to dominate. Excuse me. Model inclusive language. I apologize. Common beneficial practices include avoid using masculine pronouns for both males and females. Getting over a cold, so I apologize. Use multiple and diverse examples, multicultural examples, visual aids, materials, as much as possible that address different cultures. And then address offensive, discriminatory, insensitive comments right as they happen. We have to do that. We have to hold our students accountable for their behavior while we're also checking ourselves, making sure that we are accountable as well. Here's the fantastic website that I mentioned earlier. Idea for EMS is a project that came from National Registry of EMTs almost a couple years ago. And there's a website for you. It has so many resources. It has resources for educators, for operations and HR managers. It includes resources for improved student success, improving patient care. There are articles, recorded webinars, grant information. It's all at your fingertips on this website. This national group has been working hard to create actionable items for us all to learn from, to utilize and help to promote inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in EMS. Again, like I said, the registry had begun this about 2 years ago or almost 2 years ago, and there have been many accomplishments, but they're still meeting because there's still a lot of work to do. So please, if you have not been to that website, please go to that website, ideaforems.com. It's a very interactive website and it's got a lot of resources for you. Boy, have we grown in EMS. Remember when we used to be just all circled into these three things: healthcare, public safety, public health. That's it. If you look at the EMS Agenda 2050, you have a people-centered vision. And this vision starts now. The future starts now. So let's look at all of these areas where EMS has grown, move forward, be all-inclusive, and really work hard to make that vision statement that we had at the beginning of this session a reality. Some learning opportunities. Bring in leaders of various races and genders from the public safety and healthcare fields to speak about their experiences. Encourage your students to volunteer in the community in a soup kitchen, a homeless shelter, a women's shelter. Your clinical sites. Maybe an alternate setting could be working with hearing impaired, special needs, that kind of thing. Group work, mix it up in the classroom. Don't allow your students to create their own groups, because again, they're going to go to those groups that tend to look like the same as them. So let's mix it up. Team-based learning allows teams to work together. And again, we're no longer where we're standing in front of the classroom, just using a PowerPoint and preaching our sermons. We really need our students to be part of a team. Being in EMS is teamwork, and teamwork makes the dream work. So work on those in your classes. To learn more, there's a plethora of information out there at your fingertips. Reach out to those who are of a different race, different gender, talk openly, different culture. Spread your wealth of knowledge. Once you get that wealth of knowledge, spread it. Be an inclusive person, be consistent. Know that each of your students will remember you for the rest of their life. So make it a good one. They'll be a better practitioner based on this experience that they received in your classroom. And then finally, here are my references that I have in here. Like I said, much of this you will get from the Foundation of Education. You can get the EMS Agenda 2050 from ems.gov. The idea for ems.com has a lot of resources, like I said, and please go out there and learn. So I appreciate this opportunity. I think we'll spend the next 10 or so minutes doing a Q&A. We'll go through your messages in your chat and your Q&A, and I will stop sharing my presentation. I will show you my face. As you can see, I do have blonde hair. I am one of those. So let's go into the Q&A. What is an objective bias survey? I hope I answered that. You can Google it. Google is very good, but the Harvard one is a very good objective bias survey. So I hope that helped you with that. Should white males leave this profession? Or is that bias thinking that? No, white males should not leave this profession, but there's room for others to join the white males. So that is really that question. How do you feel about entrance exams? Since the COA needs overall pass rates reported, if there's no entrance policy, that will most likely cause a ripple effect, I would think, correct? Entrance exams. So you do need entrance exams. What if you had an opportunity for people to prepare for those entrance exams? Would that be a possibility? I'm asking, I'm not saying. I do not teach an initial education currently. So I would put that back on you. Is there an opportunity to help prepare for those entrance exams? And if so, I hope that you take advantage of that. Okay, thank you, Ruth, for answering that you did take the Harvard test. So I appreciate that. And I don't see any open questions anymore. Let's go into the chat. Is there anything in the chat that help? I like to use the term paramedics or firefighters, police officers. That's right. It helps eliminate the bias. Start thinking as professionals for sure. Should bias education should it be reflected in learning outcomes? Absolutely. They, them, and their. Those, you see a lot of signatures now on emails that have their pronouns. And that's something that's come up recently, and that's good. They, them, their, and rather than he, she, etc. I appreciate the kind comments. It is emotionally impactful topic to cover because I'll tell you, when our governor about a year and a half ago made it mandatory for everyone with a healthcare license to go through bias training to maintain that license. So before their next renewal period, they have to go through some bias education. A lot of people came out of her announcement saying, oh, we were heroes dealing with COVID, now we're racist. Well, that's kind of a bias. That isn't what she said at all. We all have an opportunity to grow. And if you look through research, which is objective, that research shows that there are disparities. So if we can recognize that and really work on improving how we teach and how we set up our classrooms, we'll do better. Technology can be a bias. I see another comment on that. Everyone has a story to tell. I like that comment because we all do have a story to tell. And every single one of us have experiences that would shock other people. And it really takes just a good listener to recognize this stuff. So take the time to get to know your students, learn this stuff. I agree, Patricia Tritt, Pat put a suggestion in there to add cultural competency or cultural humility to the affective domain evaluation. I highly agree with that, and I think that would be great. So Benjamin put a comment in there. I work for LA Fire. We had implicit bias training. It was eye-opening as to how our upbringing and environment can create biases without egregious behavior, and 100%. So I really appreciate your comments. I appreciate you all attending today. Please, if you have any questions, reach out to me if you have any comments.